Hi, I'm Mike Dwyer, and thanks for joining us at the Guardian Jet Learning Center. Today we're going to discuss the optimal conditions for when it makes sense to charter an aircraft, when it makes sense to purchase fractional lift, and when it makes sense to purchase a whole aircraft. Our conversation will be a brief summary of the pros and cons of each scenario, charter, fractional, and whole ownership, and then we'll also go into the financial model. And from the financial model, we'll look at how each solution makes sense at different levels of utilization, meaning flight hours per year. Okay, so from a financial perspective, we're going to look at four things. We'll look at capital required, we'll look at fixed cost, variable cost, and residual value or terminal value, and we're going to use a 5-year study to do that. Okay, so in a nutshell, here's how it looks financially. Charter has zero capital costs, as you'd expect. You don't buy anything. Zero fixed costs, variable costs that are completely relative to how much you fly. So it'll start at zero and move up. And of course, no residual value or terminal value. In a fractional, we'll have low capital cost, especially at low levels of utilization, fairly high fixed cost, fairly high variable cost, and that's just built into the model because you're paying for only occupied seat hours, so you have to include deadhead in your operating cost, and then low residual or terminal value, which you'd expect with the low capital requirement at the front. Whole ownership, the simple model is very high capital cost relative to charter or fractional, high fixed cost, very low variable costs over the life of the analysis, and then very high residual value at the end of the analysis. So let's talk about the pros and cons of charter first. And the obvious ones, as we discussed, no capital required, no fixed cost, only pay for what you use, so you have no long-term financial commitment. You have a lot of flexibility in scheduling your charter. The con side of charter is that you have less control over the operation, the flight operation, the vendors in complete control, and also availability. Also, at high levels of utilization, where you're doing a lot of charter, you may need more than one vendor. So you may need more than one charter operator to accomplish your goal. All right, let's talk about the pros and cons of fractional now. So one of the biggest pros, one point of contact. You pick up the phone, you make one call, and you've scheduled your trip. Another big point, a second, very high quality of service, especially in all the significant fractional providers. Just a great product. I mean, the customer experience is very good. You have the ability, very important, to fit the airplane to the mission. So later, when we do the financial modeling, we're going to use the Gulfstream G450, long-range international aircraft. Well, if you have a mission for a domestic aircraft, much smaller aircraft, you can interchange one G450 hours for more time in a smaller aircraft. So it makes you very flexible, very nimble to fit your aircraft to the mission of the day. The other advantage is no positioning cost. So in fractional, all you pay for is your occupied seat hour. When your seat is, you're sitting in the chair and you're going somewhere, you're paying for it. Nothing to position, which you'll have typically in a whole ownership. You'll have 10 to 20% deadhead, repositioning. In charter, it's a function of how you travel, but you will have positioning from the base of origin for the charter aircraft. So that's a big plus for fractional, that you're not paying any deadhead or positioning fees. Another big advantage in fractional is multiple departure points. So fractional is indifferent if you have bases of operation in New York and Chicago, and it will pick you up where you are, as opposed to, you obviously couldn't have one airplane that you own service two bases of operation. The other big advantage besides multiple departure points is simultaneous departures. Even if you're in the same location, say New York City, Monday morning at 9 a.m. you could depart 2 flights at the same time to different origins. You obviously can't do that in wholly owned. And of course, another big advantage to fractional, if you're especially at the lower utilization levels, lower capital cost to get involved and purchase the share as opposed to the ownership. The only con to fractional is at very high levels of utilization, and we'll talk more about this later in the financial modeling. It can get expensive at the higher levels of utilization. Okay, now we'll finish with the pros and cons for whole ownership. And the biggest is 100% control. If you want that, you can select, your crew, your maintenance people. You just have a lot to say about what goes on in your flight operation if that is important to you. Also, very high customer service. We already said charter and fractional can have a great customer experience. It's not going to be as good in a wholly owned airplane where you've customized the airplane to exactly the way you like it, and your regular, crew is always seeing you as the passenger. So you got to give a bump to quality of the product to wholly owned aircraft. Also, at at high levels of utilization, you get a low life cycle cost. You have high capital costs and high fixed costs, we've talked about already. But boy, at those low variable costs, you start to gain ground when you're flying at higher levels of utilization. So that would definitely be a pro on the whole ownership side. On the con side, one aircraft fits all missions. So you have less flexibility as you do in selecting charter solutions or fractional. Obviously, you have no simultaneous departures. You've got positioning fees, deadheading. You're usually going to run, depending on the way you travel and your travel patterns, 10 to 20% deadhead. No multiple origins of departure. And when you're down for maintenance, you have to schedule your travel around that, whether it's scheduled or unscheduled maintenance. And then very high life cycle costs at very low levels of utilization, so inverse to the fractional. So that's the pros and cons of whole ownership. Okay, now let's look at, we said we'd do some financial modeling, and we're going to do that for the three scenarios at different levels of utilization. So let's start with the assumptions that we're going to use, because any financial projection, you're going to want to be clear about that. We're going to use the G450, Gulfstream G450, that'll be our aircraft, and we'll say it's a new airplane. We're going to use 100% business use of this. We're going to do an after-tax calculation. We're going to pay cash for the airplane, so there'll be no financing, and we'll have fairly regular out and back travel patterns. Okay, so we're not going to have any significant deadhead beyond about 20%. Okay, so looking at the three scenarios, you just a very simple table. In charter, you have no capital, no fixed costs, about $7,000 per hour a year, $7,000 per flight hour. That's going to move around a little bit with fuel surcharges, etc., and different markets, but that's a good place for our budgeting. Zero residual value. In the fractional, the $4.5 million, that's for 100 flight hours per year, or what we call an eighth share. And so that's 1/8 of a $36 million new G450. And moving down to fixed costs, we're going to use $500,000 per year per 100 hours. So the way the fractional model works, as your fraction goes up from eighth to quarter to 3/4, your fixed costs will incrementally increase as well. Your variable costs will stay constant, and $6,500 is a pretty good number to use for your base rate plus your fuel surcharge and FET. And also the residual value at the end of the 5 years, we're using $2.25 million, or 50% of your purchase price. Talk a little bit more about that percentage when we get to whole ownership. So that's the modeling we'll do with the fractional. And then in whole ownership, we'll say let's go buy a new G450 at $36 million. We're going to have something like $800,000 of fixed costs. Our variable costs will be $4,700 per flight hour, and I'm going to give it a 70% residual at the end of the 5-year period, $25 million, a little bit higher, about 20 basis points higher than the fractional residual, because a privately operated aircraft will have less time on it and be worth more at the end of the same period. Thanks. Okay, so now let's show you on the graph what these looks like, where the financial 5-year life cycle cost of each of the scenarios looks over different levels of utilization. So we build you a graph. The x-axis moving left to right is just utilization, or annual flight hours. We go from 0 to 500. And on the y-axis, again starting at $0, we move up and show you the 5-year life cycle cost at different levels of utilization. So again, we'll start again with charter, and as you'd imagine, with no fixed costs and no capital costs, it starts right at the origin, 0, and just climbs out incrementally away from there up to the 500 hours. It's a fairly straightforward line to graph, because you're only looking at variable costs. If we look at fractional, now we're going to start higher on the y-axis than a charter because we assumed you had to buy at least 50 hours of a fraction, so you had some capital and you had some fixed costs. And then those costs will go up as you see in the green line. Notice that the fractional starts higher than charter and diverges. So clearly fractional will always be more expensive than charter regardless of the utilization. So you'd only want to purchase fractional for the premium that we discussed in the pros and the cons for both scenarios. Okay, now the more interesting is the whole ownership, because obviously we're starting again higher on the y-axis because we have much higher capital and higher fixed costs. But remember, the slope of this line climbs less steeply away because of the lower variable cost. So in this scenario, it doesn't intersect with charter at all on this graph. It actually does out at about 850 hours. Very, very high utilization for a wholly owned aircraft. But we pass fractional at about 150 hours. And so financially, whole ownership makes sense above it and fractional makes sense below it before we factor in the other pros and cons that we've discussed. And again, this is using the financial assumptions that we did in this case. So that is how this looks graphically, and we're happy to, we'll discuss next just how that intersection point and those slopes will vary with different parameters. Okay, so now in closing, we've discussed all the elements that go into modeling the solutions, charter, fractional, and whole, and what makes sense for your individual situation. Keep in mind that it's very important where those lines cross, and also the slope of those lines will be deeply influenced by the variables that go into the financial assumptions. They can move significantly with things like pre-tax or after-tax. Is it personal use or business, which of course affects the tax implications. And most importantly, with tax implications and tax benefit, the depreciation. Do we use new equipment or used equipment? Because used equipment will of course be lower capital when buying either a fraction or a wholly owned aircraft. And that's a pretty fair analysis against fractional or charter, because the airplane that shows up is obviously pre-owned at that time, versus you going out and purchasing a brand new aircraft. Your travel patterns will make a big difference. How many authorized users there are for the aircraft, and do you do out and back travel or extended stays at a particular destination? That's going to influence your cost structure. Do you pay cash or finance the aircraft, or do a leasing model? That'll definitely move interest cost and interest, tax benefits into the conversation. The time value of money, if you want to apply a discount rate to the capital that you're spending for whole or fractional equipment. So those things are going to very much influence the shape of the graph and the intersection point of utilization. So at Guardian Jet, we welcome the opportunity to discuss your individual situation in great detail so that we could build a model that is customized just for you to help you select between the options and where they make sense. Thank you very much for coming to the Guardian Jet Learning Center to discuss this topic with us today.